The basement was a place of shadows and quiet murmurings, filled with the musty scent of dust and memories that lingered like ghosts in the corners. Evan sat on the worn sofa, staring at the bare cement walls, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the armrest. The space was dimly lit, the only source of light a narrow window near the ceiling that filtered in the faintest hint of the afternoon sun. It was a room that carried the weight of its own history, the remnants of childhood toys and faded boxes that sat untouched along the far wall. The air was thick with the smell of concrete and time, mingling with the chemical tang of paint and old, lacquered wood. Connor sat across from him, slouched in a rickety armchair. The faint whir of the dehumidifier was the only sound, a soft, mechanical hum that seemed to fill the silence between them. He held a vape in one hand, its metallic surface glinting dully in the half-light. Connor exhaled, a stream of vapor swirling into the dimness, curling upward toward the ceiling before dispersing like a fading thought. Evan watched the vapor dissipate, feeling a familiar tug of yearning, a need for something he couldn't quite name. He glanced at Connor, whose eyes were half-lidded, staring vacantly at the ceiling. "Can I have a hit?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a murmur, betraying a hint of coyness. Connor turned his head slightly, a smirk touching the corners of his mouth. Without a word, he held out the vape, the offer casual and almost dismissive, as though this were some unspoken ritual they had fallen into over the past 2 weeks. Evan took the vape, lifting it to his lips and inhaling deeply. The vapor filled his lungs, bringing with it a fleeting sense of lightness, a momentary escape from the claustrophobic stillness of the room. He let the vapor out slowly, watching it drift away, carrying with it some fragment of his unease. They were both waiting. Waiting for Arca, for the call that would give them direction, a hint of what this hour-long video should be. They had spent days in this basement, heads bent over laptops, lost in the maze of ideas and possibilities, but always with the sense that something crucial eluded them. In the city, there had been noise, people, the constant press of existence, but here, at Evan's parents' house, time seemed to stretch out endlessly, each minute dissolving into the next in a haze of sameness. "Let's get out of here," Evan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the drone of the dehumidifier. He stood up, feeling a surge of restlessness. "The nature center, remember? The Greenberg one, just a few miles from here. We need to clear our heads." Connor looked at him, his eyes slightly unfocused, as though he were gazing at something far beyond the walls of the basement. "Right," he said slowly, the word dragging out as if it carried the weight of some distant memory. "Nature center. Sounds like a plan. But first." He gestured vaguely at the stairs leading up to the house. "Provisions." Evan nodded, already moving toward the steps. He knew what Connor meant. The alcohol was upstairs, locked in his parents' closet, a stash they believed was secure. His parents, strict, hovering, as if his adulthood were some delicate illusion they had to carefully maintain. But they were wrong to think they could keep everything out of reach. He had learned the trick of breaking into the closet months ago, the knife slipping between the doorframe and the latch with practiced ease. "Be right back," he muttered, climbing the stairs. The hallway above was narrow, filled with the scents of wood polish and old carpet. He moved quietly, the creak of the floorboards under his feet muffled by the heavy air. At his parents' bedroom door, he paused, listening for any sign of movement in the house. The silence was thick, unbroken, almost unnerving. The closet door opened reluctantly under his hand. He fished out the butter knife from his pocket, sliding the blade into the gap by the lock. There was a familiar tension, a brief resistance, then a soft click as the latch gave way. Inside, the bottles stood in neat rows, glassy sentinels to a forbidden world. Evan grabbed the vodka, its weight comforting in his grip, and quietly closed the door, leaving the room as if he had never been there. Back in the basement, he dropped the bottle onto the coffee table with a dull thud. "Got it," he said, reaching for a pair of cans from the mini-fridge tucked under the workbench. Lime seltzer. It was all they had, but it would do to wash down the harshness of the vodka. Connor leaned forward, watching as Evan poured the vodka into mugs and added a splash of seltzer. The mixture fizzed briefly, releasing a sharp, citrusy scent into the room. "To the unknown," Evan said, raising his mug with a wry smile. "To survival," Connor echoed, clinking his mug against Evan's. They drank, the vodka burning its way down, leaving a bitter aftertaste that the lime seltzer barely masked. It was a ritual, a preparation for the journey ahead, the momentary buzz like a dim light in the darkness of their waiting. The garage was cluttered, filled with boxes and old tools, relics of a life Evan had tried to leave behind but now found himself mired in. In the corner, the bikes leaned against the wall, tires half deflated, the frames coated with a thin layer of dust. Evan grabbed the pump, crouching beside the second bike as he worked the valve, each push of air bringing the tires back to life with a slow, steady resistance. The task had a strange urgency to it, a feeling that this simple act was a small rebellion against the weight of his surroundings. Connor stood by the open garage door, his gaze drifting out into the driveway, where the sunlight pooled in uneven patches. "So, we bike," he said, almost to himself. "Through the suburbs, through this realm." Evan looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead, his eyes catching Connor's distant expression. "Yeah," he replied. "It's like we're passing through layers. This place, it's not quite here, not quite real. But the nature center, maybe it's a way out. Or at least a different way in." Connor nodded slowly, fishing his phone out of his pocket. It buzzed with messages, plans forming in the digital void from artists scattered across the city and beyond. He was always making connections, finding those who shared his odd sensibilities. But today, he was here, in this quiet, stagnant suburb, with Evan and the promise of something different. They mounted their bikes and rolled out of the garage, Evan tapping his phone to open Google Maps. A route flickered into view, a line winding through the streets and into the wooded area that housed the nature center. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, feeling its weight like a compass, though he doubted his own ability to follow it perfectly. The bikes rolled out into the driveway, tires humming softly against the concrete. Evan glanced down at his phone, the screen glowing faintly in the warm afternoon light. Google Maps showed a winding path leading through the suburban labyrinth of Scarsdale and into the wooded area where the nature center lay hidden. The route flickered before his eyes, a thin blue line snaking through the streets like a fragile thread of connection to something beyond the orderly life that enclosed him. Evan hesitated, the phone suddenly feeling heavy in his pocket, its smooth surface cold against his skin. It was more than just a navigational tool, it was a reminder of how tethered he was to these spaces, to the layers of reality he could not escape. He slipped it into his jacket, feeling its weight like a compass, though a sense of doubt gnawed at him. His sense of direction was poor, always had been. He relied on maps, on signals, on digital voices to guide him through even the most familiar terrain. Today would be no different. Connor was already straddling his bike, one foot on the ground, the other poised on the pedal, waiting with an air of nonchalance. His eyes drifted across the driveway, past the meticulously trimmed hedges, the quiet street lined with parked cars. The vape dangled from his lips, and he took a slow drag, the vapor curling up around his face like the ghosts of his thoughts. "You good to go?" Connor asked, his voice muffled as he exhaled, the vapor dispersing into the air. The way he lingered, his gaze drifting in the direction of the sun that hovered just above the rooftops, suggested a restlessness, a need to push past the edges of this neighborhood, this life, and into something else. Evan nodded, tightening his grip on the handlebars. "Yeah. Just, stay close," he replied, his tone half command, half plea. He felt a surge of anxiety, an unease that grew from the knowledge of his own incompetence in navigating the world around him. The Bluetooth speaker in his bag began to hum as it connected to his phone, then erupted in an ambient drone, the music swelling in slow, dissonant waves. It was the kind of soundscape they both loved, unusual, electronic, almost alien in its composition. Perfect for a journey like this. They started down the driveway, picking up speed as they turned onto the main road. The tires crackled over the small pebbles scattered across the asphalt, their rhythm syncing with the pulsating beats emanating from Evan's bag. The neighborhood blurred around them in a mix of sunlight and shadow, the houses and trees blending into a moving backdrop. Evan kept his eyes fixed on the road, though his mind wandered, stretching out to the destination that lay somewhere beyond the town's borders. The ride began easily enough, the terrain flat, the air warm against their faces. The streets here were wide, bordered by neat rows of trees whose leaves whispered in the faint breeze. It was the very beginning of autumn, a season poised on the edge of change. Evan glanced up at the canopy overhead, where the leaves were just starting to curl at the edges, tinged with the first hints of gold and amber. He felt a pang, an awareness of time slipping by, of the slow turning of cycles that moved with or without him. They cruised past houses with their perfect facades, past yards dotted with children's toys left scattered in the grass, past the occasional jogger or dog walker who glanced at them with mild curiosity before returning to their own routines. To Evan, it all seemed staged, as though the world had arranged itself into a tableau for them to pass through, an impression of life rather than life itself. He looked back at Connor, who lagged a few feet behind, his expression distant, lost in some thought that Evan could only guess at. "You all right back there?" Evan called out, his voice slicing through the ambient soundscape. Connor lifted his head, his eyes meeting Evan's for a brief moment. There was a glimmer of something in that gaze, perhaps irritation, perhaps impatience, but it faded as he nodded. "I'm here," he replied, his words drifting lazily, absorbed into the hum of the speaker's music. He sped up slightly, closing the distance between them, though he remained a half-step behind, as if unwilling to fully commit to the pace. They rode on, navigating the labyrinthine streets of Scarsdale. Evan checked his phone intermittently, the screen flashing with the route's twists and turns. He squinted at the tiny arrow, his sense of direction faltering whenever he came to an intersection. Twice, he led them down the wrong street, the path diverging from the intended line on the screen. Each time, he muttered a curse, stopping to recalibrate as Connor pulled up beside him, silent but watchful. "Thought you knew where we were going," Connor remarked during one such stop, his tone light but edged with irony. "I do," Evan snapped, though he knew it wasn't true. His palms were sweaty, and he gripped the handlebars too tightly, the ache in his fingers a reflection of his internal tension. "It's just, the roads here, they all look the same. It's easy to get turned around." Connor said nothing, merely shrugged and looked away, his eyes scanning the horizon. The streets had indeed grown more labyrinthine as they progressed, the houses spaced further apart, the trees thickening into clusters that cast deeper shadows across their path. It was as if they were moving through a series of layers, each one folding into the next, obscuring their sense of progress. Finally, the road began to climb, the incline gradual at first, then steepening into a slow, grueling ascent. Evan felt the strain in his legs, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he pedaled harder, pushing against the resistance. The tires dug into the asphalt, making a soft, crunching sound with every turn of the wheel. Connor lagged behind again, the incline sapping his speed. His face was flushed, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. He glanced up at Evan, who was struggling just as much, his movements growing labored. "This is madness," Connor panted, his voice barely rising above the music that throbbed in the air around them. "We're going to kill ourselves before we even get there." Evan looked back, his chest heaving. He wanted to argue, to insist they keep going, but he knew Connor was right. The road ahead continued to climb, a steep, unforgiving slope that mocked their attempts to conquer it. With a resigned sigh, he braked to a stop, dismounting and placing one foot on the ground. "All right," he gasped, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "We walk." Connor nodded, relief washing over his features as he swung his leg over the bike and stood beside it. They began to push the bikes uphill, each step a small battle against the incline, the ground uneven and strewn with gravel. The sun bore down on them, the warmth oppressive, and yet the air around them was tinged with the crispness of early autumn, a reminder of the season that was creeping in. The landscape around them changed as they climbed, the houses thinning out, replaced by patches of woodland that bordered the road. The trees rose high above them, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. It was cooler here, the air carrying the scent of pine and earth, mingling with the faint traces of decay that always accompanied the turning of the leaves. As they walked, a silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Evan's mind wandered, drifting through the layers of thoughts that had piled up over the past weeks. The waiting, the uncertainty about the video project with Arca, the sense of being trapped in this house under his parents' watchful eyes. It all weighed on him, a constant reminder of the limits that boxed him in. He glanced at Connor, whose eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his face set in an expression of grim determination. Evan wondered what thoughts coursed through his friend's mind, what private demons he battled as they trudged up this hill. They were both outsiders in their own ways, caught in a world that didn't quite fit them. Their art, their projects, were attempts to grasp at something real, something that lay beyond the edges of their daily lives. And yet, here they were, struggling up a hill in the middle of suburbia, seeking out a nature center as if it held the answers to their unspoken questions. You ever think, Evan began, his voice rough with exertion, that places like this, they're like echoes? Not real, but reflections of what we think is real. Connor looked over at him, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, his words dragging like the pull of gravity on their legs. Or maybe it's us who are the echoes. Passing through, seeing, but never quite, touching. Evan fell silent, the words hanging in the air between them, unsettling in their simplicity. It was a thought he had often entertained but never voiced. The idea that they were the ones out of place, intruders in a reality that continued regardless of their presence. They reached the crest of the hill, the road leveling out, and stopped to catch their breath. Before them, the path wound through a grove of trees, the dappled light forming a tunnel that beckoned them forward. It was beautiful, almost ethereal, and for a moment, Evan felt a strange calm wash over him, a brief respite from the turmoil that had dogged him since they left the house. There it is, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The nature center. Connor followed his gaze, squinting through the shadows of the trees. The entrance lay ahead, a modest gate partially obscured by ivy and undergrowth. It didn't look like much, just a simple sign marking the boundary between one world and the next. Yet it held a quiet significance, a promise of something they could not name but desperately sought. Let's go, Connor said, his voice steady. And with that, they mounted their bikes once more, coasting down the gentle slope that led toward the gate, the leaves rustling in the breeze as they passed beneath the arching branches. They stood before the entrance, a modest archway that led into the heart of the nature center. The gate creaked open as they pushed through, its hinges groaning as if it were reluctant to let them pass. The interior felt different from the outdoor enclosures, enclosed and humid, the air filled with an earthy scent that mingled with the faint odor of animals and disinfectant. A dim, filtered light poured in through skylights, casting an ethereal glow over the hallway that stretched out before them. Inside, the soundscape shifted. Gone was the rustle of leaves and distant chirps, instead, there was the hum of machinery, air filters, heating lamps, and water pumps. It was oddly comforting, like stepping into a cocoon removed from the reality outside. Yet, beneath this comfort lay a tension, a sense of eyes watching from the shadows. Evan couldn't quite shake the feeling that they were being observed, though the building seemed deserted. They moved forward, the hallway opening into a series of interconnected rooms filled with glass enclosures. Each tank held a small world, vibrant and alien. Lizards lounged beneath heat lamps, their eyes half-lidded and inscrutable. Some were vibrant green, their scales glistening like jewels, while others were mottled brown and gray, camouflaged against the artificial logs and rocks placed in their tanks. In a nearby tank, a chameleon perched on a branch, its skin shifting hues with a languid grace. "Look at this guy," Connor muttered, tapping the glass gently with a knuckle. The chameleon's eye swiveled independently of its head, fixing on Connor for a moment before drifting away again, as though he were of no consequence. "Do you think it knows it's being watched?" Evan asked, his voice quiet, almost reverent. He pressed his hand to the glass, feeling the coolness against his palm. The chameleon's world was small, controlled, yet it moved with the slow, deliberate pace of something ancient, timeless. Connor smirked, shaking his head. "I doubt it. Or maybe it does, and it just doesn't care. Kind of like us, right? Surrounded by eyes, but in the end, we just go on, living our own weird little lives." Evan let his hand drop, feeling a shiver run up his arm. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about this place unsettled him. It wasn't just the animals, though they held an undeniable strangeness. It was the way the air seemed to hum, the way shadows collected in the corners, the way time felt slow and thick, stretching each second into an elongated echo. They moved through the rooms in a daze, peering into tanks that housed fish with gaping mouths and eyes that glinted in the dim light. A tank filled with axolotls drew their attention. The creatures floated in the murky water, their feathery gills fanning out like delicate fronds. Their pale, translucent bodies glowed faintly, ghost-like in their movements. "This place was definitely made for kids," Connor said after a while, gesturing toward a nearby display board with cartoonish illustrations explaining the amphibian life cycle. Evan nodded absently. "Yeah, but I kind of love it," he admitted, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "There's something pure about it. No pretense. It just is." Connor shot him a sidelong glance, one eyebrow raised. "You sound like you're about to have a revelation, mate. Don't get too existential on me in the middle of the lizard room." Evan laughed softly, but there was a hint of tension in his voice. He turned away, focusing on a rodent enclosure filled with tunnels and wheels. The hamsters and gerbils darted back and forth, oblivious to the world beyond their glass prison. It struck him as both sad and strangely beautiful. They lived in a world crafted for them, unaware of anything outside their immediate surroundings. He wondered, fleetingly, if that was how he and Connor were, as much prisoners of their own existence as these creatures. They continued exploring, moving from room to room, the exhibits blurring into a surreal tapestry of life encased in glass. It was somewhere in the bird room, surrounded by the fluttering of small, brightly colored finches, that they first noticed her. She stood near the far wall, partially hidden in the shadows, her posture awkward and slightly hunched. The volunteer girl. She had an odd demeanor, pleasantly dorky, with an air of quiet observation that made her seem out of place amidst the children-oriented displays. She watched them, her eyes following their movements with an intensity that was unsettling in its quietness. "Is she staring at us?" Connor whispered, leaning toward Evan. Evan glanced over his shoulder, catching the girl's gaze. She didn't look away, simply smiled faintly and took a step forward. "I think she works here," he muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Just, let her do her thing." Connor nodded, though his eyes darted toward her intermittently as they moved toward a large aviary enclosure. The birds inside flitted about, their feathers catching the light in flashes of red, blue, and yellow. The space was filled with soft rustling, the beat of tiny wings against the mesh wire, a sound that was oddly soothing in the midst of their unease. The girl approached them then, her steps nearly silent against the tiled floor. She stopped a few feet away, hands clasped in front of her, her smile both welcoming and strangely empty. "Is there anything you'd like to see up close?" she asked, her voice soft, almost melodic. It didn't quite match her demeanor, creating a slight dissonance that made Evan's skin prickle. Evan hesitated, glancing at Connor. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. What did they want to see? What did they hope to find here, in this miniature world? "The chinchilla," he blurted out, more out of impulse than anything. "Can we see the chinchilla?" The girl's smile widened, a flash of something inscrutable passing through her eyes. "Of course," she said, her tone gentle, almost maternal. She turned and walked toward the back of the room, disappearing through a door marked staff only. Connor shot Evan a look, his eyebrows raised. Really? The chinchilla? Evan shrugged, his hands slipping into his pockets. Why not? We're here, aren't we? Might as well, experience it. Connor didn't reply, simply shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. They waited in the room, the sound of the birds filling the silence between them. It was almost peaceful, but the peace was tinged with an undercurrent of something darker, something that lurked just beyond the edges of their perception. The girl returned a few moments later, cradling the chinchilla in her hands. It was a small, delicate creature, its fur an impossibly soft gray. She approached them, her movements fluid and purposeful, as though she were performing some ancient ritual. Here, she said, holding out the chinchilla. You can pet it, but be gentle. It's fragile. Evan reached out first, his fingers brushing against the fur. It was softer than anything he had ever felt, a texture that defied reality. The chinchilla twitched its nose, eyes blinking slowly up at him, as if assessing his worthiness. There was a moment, a brief, flickering moment, when he felt a connection, something that transcended the glass and metal of the enclosure that had encased their experience thus far. Connor followed suit, his touch hesitant, almost reverent. The chinchilla remained still, its tiny heart beating rapidly beneath the fur. It's like holding a piece of a dream, Connor murmured, his eyes locked on the animal's face. Something not meant for this world. The girl watched them, her expression unreadable. It is fragile, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Like all beautiful things. Evan looked up at her, a question forming on his lips, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. There was something about her, about this place, that rendered words inadequate. He withdrew his hand, stepping back, the weight of the room pressing in on him. Thank you, he said finally, his voice hollow. We should, probably head out. The girl nodded, her gaze lingering on them as she turned and carried the chinchilla back to the staff room. They watched her go, the door closing behind her with a soft click that resonated through the room like the final note of a song. Evan and Connor stood in silence for a moment, the atmosphere thickening around them. Then, without a word, they turned and made their way toward the exit. The building seemed to sigh as they left, the door closing with a faint creak that sounded almost like a whisper. Underscore 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 underscore. The ride back was subdued, the daylight waning as they coasted down the hill. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. Evan navigated through the familiar streets, his phone safely tucked away. He relied now on memory, on the twists and turns they had struggled through earlier, but the way back felt different, easier, though no less strange. The speaker in his bag played softly, an ambient drone that matched the rhythm of their pedaling. The music filled the silence between them, a buffer against the thoughts that threatened to surface. Evan glanced at Connor, who rode slightly behind, his expression distant. That was something, Evan said, his voice carried back by the wind. Connor nodded but didn't reply. His eyes were fixed ahead, on the road that unfurled before them like a path through the unknown. They were moving forward, yet the destination felt elusive, shifting with every push of the pedal. By the time they reached the driveway, the dusk had settled into a deep blue, the first stars appearing in the sky above. They dismounted, walking their bikes into the garage. The air inside was cool, filled with the sense of oil and dust, a stark contrast to the humid, earthy atmosphere of the nature center. Evan shut the garage door behind them, the sound echoing in the stillness. He felt a weariness settle into his bones, a heaviness that was more than physical exhaustion. It was as if the day had taken something from him, left a mark he could not see but could feel in the quiet spaces of his mind. Connor leaned his bike against the wall, rubbing the back of his neck. "Worth it?" he asked, his tone light but tinged with an edge of doubt. Evan hesitated, staring at the ground. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it was." They stood there, the silence wrapping around them like a shroud. And in that silence, the nature center lingered, a fragment of an experience that defied explanation, a place that existed now only in the recesses of their memories, haunting and elusive. Evan sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "Let's go inside," he said finally. "It's getting cold." Connor nodded, and they moved toward the door that led into the house. As they stepped over the threshold, the garage fell into darkness behind them, sealing off the day's events like a chapter in a story they could not quite understand. In the basement, they collapsed onto their chairs, the hum of the dehumidifier filling the space around them. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The nature center had left its mark, an imprint on their minds that would linger in the quiet hours of the night, a reminder of everything they could touch but never hold, everything they could see but never truly know.